I was standing at the mailbox at the end of the driveway, checking my mail when a red BMW drove by and pulled into a neighbor's garage. As he pulled up to their garage, the door opened to let the bimmer in and then closed again. This seemed odd. I knew Kyle Good was out of town. Why would some guy drive into their garage? I figured there could be dozens of reasons. A cousin, maybe Doris's brother? Who knows? But it certainly didn't concern me. I quickly forgot about the incident when I noticed a letter in my mailbox from my sister, who lives in Florida. Gina always writes great letters full of family news and lots of articles clipped from the dozen or so publications she subscribes to. The next morning, as I was driving out of my house to go to work, a Beamer whizzed past me at such a high rate of speed that I had time to slow down before I rear-ended it. I probably would have ignored the incident had my wife Jenny and I not stopped in front of the Goods house on Friday night while walking the dog. The red BMW was parked on the street, and Kyle Good was standing on the porch talking to a guy I had seen earlier that week, driving that car. Kyle and the guy approached us as we continued walking down the sidewalk. George, Jenny, hi. Jenny and I stopped as the two men approached the sidewalk. George, I'd like you to meet my best friend Harry Thompson. Harry, this is our neighbor George. I shook Harry's hand and turned to introduce Harry to Jenny. This is my wife, Jenny. I wasn't surprised when Harry let go of my hand and took Jenny's hand, looking at her like she was dessert. When you marry a woman as beautiful as Jenny, you get used to men drooling over her. But this guy had a look on his face that I couldn't read. A smirk, perhaps, as if he knew something I didn't. Now that I knew Harry was Kyle's best friend and not related to him, thoughts began to stir in my head as to why this guy had stayed the night while Kyle was out of town. Could there be something going on between Harry and Kyle's wife, Doris? Personally, I can't imagine a lower form of life than a best friend entertaining his buddy's wife. But maybe there's an innocent explanation, like the guy was in town on business and needed a place to stay. So I asked, Harry, where do you live? Harry replied, across the river in St. Paul. Thus, I closed the subject. Harry is not a relative and doesn't live far enough away to need a room for the night while traveling. That leaves. Harry was still looking at Jenny like he was ready to pounce on her, so I said we needed to finish walking the dog and said goodbye to Kyle and Harry. That left me with a dilemma. Should I say anything to Kyle? Part of me wanted to stay out of it. Part of me realized that Kyle had become my friend since Jenny and I had moved into the neighborhood 7 months ago, and if I were in his shoes, I'd want to know if my wife was having fun. By that Sunday, I'd already made up my mind. While Kyle was mowing the lawn, I came over to chat. After pleasantries, I got right to the point. Kyle, on Monday night, while you were out of town, your best friend Harry spent the night at your house. Kyle's reaction might have knocked me off my feet. He actually chuckled as he replied, George sure did. I bet he gave Doris a treat. My mouth was open. I had no words for Kyle's statement. Kyle continued to laugh, explaining, George, I thought you knew. Doris and I have an open relationship. It took me a few seconds to realize this. So you're doing this with other people? More than that. Haven't you ever noticed that the cars here come every other month, when it's our turn to be hosts? Hosts? I still hadn't managed to come up with a coherent response to Kyle's news when he asked the inevitable question. Would you and Jenny like to join us? The question snapped me out of my stupor. No, Kyle, there's no way we would participate in something like that. As I turned to leave, I heard Kyle call out to me, Too bad. Next chapter. The thing is, this isn't the first time this issue has come up recently. 3 or 4 months ago, Jenny and I asked me about it. It wasn't until a few months later, while telling Jenny about the parties at Goods, that I remembered her question. After I left Kyle's that afternoon, I walked back to our house. Jenny was sunning herself outside. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat next to her on the patio. Jenny, do you know what the Hoods do? Jenny replied that she did. Every time Jenny talks to someone, she pulls her sunglasses up over the top of her head so the person she is talking to can see her blue eyes. Jenny's father told me years ago that he taught his children to take off their sunglasses when they are talking to another person. He told me this because he wanted me to follow the same advice. He was tired of talking to me when I shaded my eyes, and he said it made him distrust me. So I was suspicious when Jenny turned to me without taking off her sunglasses in answer to my question. No, George. Where did you get the idea? From Kyle. He said so right off the bat. I told him Harry spent Monday night at his house while he was on a business trip. He brushed it off, said he and Doris had an open relationship. Well, I don't see what that has to do with us. I can't believe you ratted Doris out to Kyle. Why would you do that? Jenny, if you were screwing with me, I'd want a real friend to tell me about it. It's still ratting. I thought all boys were taught not to be tattletales when they grow up. It all depends on the seriousness of the offense. You don't tell about insignificant things, but if it's important, then... Jenny interrupted me. What's the big deal about Doris hanging around? Who is she hurting? Before I could think about it, I was already answering Jenny. Jenny, you make it sound like adultery is something minor. For many marriages, it represents a breakup. Most spouses have a hard time dealing with their husband's or wives' infidelity. I was stunned by Jenny's response. Well, that's just silly. It's just entertainment. I was still stunned and silent when Jenny diffused the whole conversation. George, whatever the hoods do is their business, not ours. As long as we love each other, trust each other, and are true to our vows, we don't have to fight each other. Over the next few weeks, I watched Jenny more and more closely. I had to admit that almost everything in our daily lives was perfectly normal. There were no outward signals that might have made me suspicious, with two exceptions. First, one day when I picked up Jenny's smartphone to look up a phone number in her contacts, the phone was locked. This was new. Jenny had never locked her phone before, saying it was too inconvenient. Secondly, I noticed that Jenny was clearing the history on our computer. Again, Jenny had never done this before. Both a locked phone and cleared history are little things, but as someone once sang, out of little things, mama, one day come big things. None of these obstacles were difficult to clear. With some concern that I was violating Jenny's privacy, I managed to install a program on our computer that recorded all activities in the background. Jenny could erase her history, but the computer would still save it in a file that I could view. It wasn't hard to crack her phone password. I was completely at ease handing Jenny her phone and asking for her brother's phone number. I didn't even mention that the phone was locked, and Jenny didn't realize she was standing with her back to the mirror when she unlocked it. I held the phone in my hand, videotaping the image in the mirror while I waited for her to give me Matt's number. I read the messages on Jenny's phone every chance I got, and for weeks there was nothing unusual in them. Not a single call to anyone I might consider a potential lover. And nothing until I told Jenny that I needed to leave town for a week and a half on business. My job as a translator usually required traveling out of town every 2 months or so. The staff alternated business trips, so no one was stuck in them all the time. 2 days after I broke the news to her, at which time Jenny was acting very sad about me being gone so long, I read a message from Doris on Jenny's phone. We've made arrangements for Saturday. Last minute, but 5 couples have already confirmed because you'll be here again. And you know how excited Kyle and Harry are. See you? I was furious, almost to the point where I couldn't think straight. My whore wife, pretending to be sad, eagerly awaiting my absence to entertain a bunch of assholes. Rereading the text, I almost lost my senses. The word again was crucial. But it was time to get over it and start planning. I would have plenty of time later to mourn the end of my marriage. The next morning, I found and made an appointment with a divorce lawyer. Then asked my boss to let me skip the assignment. I made some bullshit excuse as to why I couldn't go and promised I'd make it up to my deputy later. He faltered, making a big deal out of the fact that I'd probably backstabbed my coworkers at least twice in the last year. After some grumbling, he agreed that I could take 10 days off. Thursday morning, I kissed Jenny goodbye, and instead of going to the airport, checked into the Residence Inn. I used the company credit card to rent a car, which was a clear violation of company policy, but by this time I didn't care and bought everything I thought I might need. On Friday, I met with a divorce attorney to see what my options were and what it would take if I divorced Jenny. Things weren't pretty. We would essentially divide all of our assets, and I might have to pay her alimony for 5 years. Jenny had a part-time job that paid very little, but gave her a discount on all the clothes she bought. Jenny loved to dress nicely. It was never a big problem. The house was always tidy, dinner was on the table most of the time, and I made good money. Now her meager salary meant that I would need to supplement her income until she could retrain for a career. Wait a minute. Are you saying she can shit on our marriage and I still have to pay her? The lawyer shrugged. Yeah, ever since the laws changed, that's the way it goes. Adultery doesn't matter if you divorce your spouse. I realize now how naive I was when it came to my wife and when it came to the law. Let's say I don't want the system to screw me. What are my options? The guy smiled. Before I say another word, write me a check for 500 because what I'm about to say implies that you and I never had this conversation and will never see each other again. I wrote the check and held it out to him. First, let me ask you 2 questions. Do you like your job? Are there any relatives nearby that you miss? I replied, I hate my job, and my parents and sister moved to Florida. The guy leaned back in his chair. Then I'll continue, but this isn't legal advice. I'll just tell you how I would have handled your situation. He paused for a second, perhaps choosing his words. I'd bloody disappear. Take what I could from the accounts and get the hell out of Dodge. That's another thing if you had kids. There's no way I'd advise a father to abandon his kids, especially with a whore mother. But in your case, I say it's a big world. Take the time to look at it. That was the last thing I expected to hear. I had to ask. Why such a drastic solution? Wouldn't I be better off taking my chances in court? You picked the wrong lawyer to answer that question. 4 years ago, I caught my wife with a trainer. The whole thing was videotaped. The tape showed them laughing at me as I worked out, and they made me look like a wimp. Nasty shit. I divorced her, even got one of the best divorce attorneys around, better than me. 4 years later, I still pay her every month and will for the next year. That's the reward you get if you treat your wife like a queen and don't force her to find a good-paying job while you are married. Let's face it, the system is rigged against people like you and me. I walked out of the lawyer's office, shaking my head, but already starting to formulate my plans. But first, I needed to know exactly what Jenny was doing with the neighbors. Next chapter. The party was scheduled for Saturday night, and if I was lucky, it would be at the Hood's house. We'd been there often enough for barbecues and pool parties that I knew the location of the house and was confident I could set up there and peek in on the festivities. But just in case, I installed a tracking app on Jenny's phone. It was a long Saturday. I spent it sitting in my hotel room waiting for her phone to indicate that she was on her way. It wasn't a long wait. At 5 p.m., Jenny left the house and went to the Hoods. I drove to our neighborhood in my rental car and parked on the next block. The Hoods have a small shed in their backyard, and I was able to sneak in without anyone seeing me by swinging over a 6-foot fence. For the next 2 hours, I used a movie camera and a camera to document the Hood's shenanigans. You can't understand the real pain in your heart until you see the woman you love, with whom you plan to have children and grow old together, cheat. After almost 2 hours of such action, I had the faces of all the participants written down. It was time to leave. As I sat in the car trying to calm down, I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I wanted to hurt Jenny and all her girlfriends, but I didn't. Instead, I went back to my hotel room, stopping by to buy a 5th Jack Daniels. I sat there wondering what I should do next. I didn't get drunk. I sat up until midnight and pondered my life and the options my lawyer had given me. The more I pondered, the more I realized that barring marriage to the woman I loved until a few hours ago, my life was shit. I hated my boss and my job. I hated living in the Midwest with its cold winters. When the temperature finally rose above freezing, You still couldn't go outside to avoid being eaten alive by mosquitoes, and those were now spread by crazy pathogens like West Nile. I hated the big house that Jenny just had to have before we had kids, with a big lawn that required watering and fertilizer and had to be mowed twice a week. There were very few neighbors I didn't care about, and that number had been cut in half. That I would leave Jenny was now a given. I've heard that there are guys who can tolerate their wives' infidelity. There are even some who enjoy it. How? I don't know. But that's not going to happen to me. I tried to fall asleep. It was difficult, but eventually fell asleep, staring at the ceiling of the hotel room for what seemed like hours, pondering how I'd screwed up and why things had gotten this way. Next chapter. After graduating from the University of Minnesota with a double major, German and Russian, the Army offered me a job. All I had to do was sign up for the next 4 years. The advantage the Army had over other options was that I wouldn't be doing 2 or 3 years of roughing it. I would take a real translation job right after basic training. I met Jenny my senior year of college while serving in the Pentagon. Jenny worked as a waitress at a bar where my friends and I would hang out. I won't lie, the main lure was her pretty face, cute smile, and killer body. We dated for 7 months before I popped the question. Jenny said yes, and we got married and built a house in Minneapolis 2 months after I got laid off. Jenny had limited abilities. I hate to say it, but for all her wonderful qualities, intelligence was not one of them. I couldn't imagine her getting another job at the bar. Hell, it was hard enough with all the guys hitting on her when we dated. Even though it meant less money, Jenny found a part-time job selling dresses. Money wasn't an issue because I was making good money, enough to buy our dream house 4 years later when prices hadn't fully recovered from the housing crash. Our primary reasons for moving to Minneapolis threw me a surprise 2 years after we moved. My dad got an offer to retire early. He and my mom decided to join the other snowbirds, sold their house, and moved to sunny Florida. My sister, who never appreciated Minnesota's cold winters, followed them. I don't want to make excuses for Jenny. There is no excuse for her participation in the hoods parties. But I think that when my mom and baby sister moved to Florida, a void was created in Jenny's life. A void that may have contributed to Jenny's subsequent affection for our new neighbors, especially Doris. After Jenny and I bought the house, we gave ourselves a year to get it cleaned up and ready before we were going to get pregnant. Instead, I'm trying to fall asleep in this strange bed, wondering what I'll be doing a year from now instead of holding my newborn baby in my arms. Waking up Sunday morning, I was glad I took it easy on the JD last night, and the hangover didn't make me feel any worse than I already did. Across the street was a diner that served a decent breakfast. I went over the list I'd made, a few things I'd want if I left, and a list of our assets, bank accounts, brokerage accounts, etc. The list of things to leave behind was short, and most of our money went toward the down payment on the house. Back in the room, I spent a couple hours sorting through the photos and videos from the previous night. It's amazing how much detail these digital cameras can pick up, even in low light. I've highlighted the best shots, the photos of the other participants I saved for another day. I didn't consider any of them innocent. They had to know Jenny was there without her husband, and in my opinion that should have made her unavailable, so to hell with them. On Monday, I got serious about an exit strategy. Jenny wasn't expecting me back from my business trip until Friday, and I had 4 days to pull everything together and try to do it right. I went to the first of 5 local car dealerships in search of my next vehicle. After finding what I wanted at 2 dealers, I made a deal with the one who gave me the best offer and drove off the dealership lot in a used converted camper van and a check for $2,000, leaving behind my 1-year-old Chrysler 300. The dealer got a better deal, but I made it through and now had a vehicle to travel in. Tuesday and Wednesday were spent getting my finances in order and outfitting the camper with everything I needed for a long trip. By Thursday, I was ready, the day before the deadline, and one of the days Jenny was working at the store. Back at our house, I loaded all the things I needed into the van. There wasn't much, and it didn't take up any more space in the van than I needed. On the kitchen table, I left a note with two pictures. One was of her with Hood and Thompson. The other was our wedding picture torn in half. I thought about leaving my wedding ring, but figured I could probably sell it somewhere along the way. It was gold and should be worth at least a tank of gas. The note said, "Jenny, I will not live with a liar and a cheat. Goodbye." Next chapter. My first stop was Naples, Florida, where my folks had moved after my father retired. Driving the van was a pleasure. I spent 12 hours behind the wheel each day, mostly on back roads, before finding a campground to stay at for the night. I quickly realized that there are good campgrounds and there are disgusting ones. I'm going to have to figure out how to tell them apart if I'm going to be traveling for a long time. On the evening of the third day, I arrived at my parents' house. I got a big hug from my mom and even a manly hug from my dad. They knew I was coming to visit, but they didn't know the details. It wasn't going to be easy. They both loved Jenny and were looking forward to the phone call about becoming grandparents. "What's going on, George? Why are you here?" I didn't want to talk about it right away, not here on the porch of their house. As we walked into the house, I had to ask, "Jenny didn't call looking for me?" Mom looked sadly into my eyes. "Why would she call and look for you? Doesn't she know you're here?" "Probably embarrassed to call and talk to either of you. I left Jenny after catching her cheating." Mom was shocked. "I can't believe it. Not Jenny." "Please believe me, Mom. I don't want to show you pictures to prove it. She contacted our neighbors, the spouse exchange group." Dad finally found his voice. "Why?" "The hell of it. I found out about it and decided to run away. I haven't talked to Jenny and I'm not going to." "You're going to get a divorce?" "That's the thing, Dad. I went to a lawyer and figured out what kind of asshole I'd be in if we went to court for a divorce. I'd be paying her alimony for years, and she'd be free to party with the neighbors in the meantime. I took the coward's way out. Quit my job, bought a van, and I'm going to wander around the neighborhood for a while." "That's not like you, son." "No, it doesn't. But maybe it's time to change your views. I graduated from college in 3 years, went straight into the Army, where I spent 4 years. Got out, found a job in the first month, got married, and then spent the last 5 years trying to get ahead so I could raise my kids with the love of my life. And here I am, 30 years old. No kids, no wife, a 4-year-old van, and about $6,000 to my name. Hell of a bargain, right?" Mom interjected. "Isn't there some way you could forgive Jenny and get back together with her? I mean, if she apologizes and promises not to do it again." I felt sorry for Mom. Always the optimist, always willing to forgive, always willing to think only good things about people. I hugged her. "No, Mom, you didn't see what I saw. Her with more than one guy. You didn't hear her claiming she was going to miss me when she thought I was going away on a business trip and then having a get-together with the neighbors and their friends. Lying was almost as bad as infidelity. Both destroyed my trust in her." Around 7 o'clock, my sister Gina showed up at our parents' house. I was happy to see my little sister again. Even though she was 5 years younger than me, we had been pretty close until I left home for college. We always made time to talk when I came home for vacations. But when I left for the military, it became harder to maintain that closeness. I hadn't realized until that evening how much I missed her and how much she had grown up. We walked along the beach. The sun had just set and the sky was bright red. Without Mom and Dad around, we were free to talk. "Jenny called me last night. She said you'd gone away and only left a note." "Did she tell you what the note said or why I left?" "No. She only asked that if I heard from you, I asked you to call her so she could explain everything. Tell me, big brother, what's going on?" "Jenny got involved with our neighbors club, without me, of course. I was supposed to be out of town on business. She set it up so she could attend the party while I was gone. I have videotapes of her with 5 different guys." I think Gina was stunned by my revelation. "Holy shit. What, did you hire a private investigator?" "No. I didn't go out of town because I knew something was going to happen. I saw the message on her phone, stayed at a hotel nearby and filmed the party myself. They weren't too secretive. When I had proof, I quit my job, bought a van, and left Minneapolis. Now I'm going to be traveling for a while. I'll start in the States, and if I have the money, I'll go to Europe. What about Jenny? Are you going to divorce her? Like I told Mom and Dad, a divorce would cripple me. I'd be paying her for years. That's not going to happen. I'll just put it all behind me. Why don't you take your little sister with you? I have a few weeks of vacation coming up, and I'd like to spend it on the road with you. As long as I don't get in your way. Gina gave me a sly smile. Gina, this isn't about finding a replacement for Jenny. It's about getting in shape. I get it. Anyway, if you're going out west, I'd like to go with you for a couple weeks. I hear Utah is really beautiful. It's a deal. We'll do it in the fall when it's less crowded and not so hot. Right now, I need you to do me a big favor. I need your computer knowledge. Gina was one of those rare women who didn't let misogyny stop her from becoming an expert programmer. What do you need, big brother? I told Gina about the videotapes and footage from Jenny's party and what I planned to do with them. As I laid out my revenge, Gina's smile grew until she couldn't keep from laughing. You got it, big brother. I can arrange it. It took a few weeks to put it all together and cover our tracks so neither of us could trace it. But 3 weeks after I left Minnesota, everything was ready. I knew Gina was good with computers, but what she was able to do stunned me. First, Gina and the guy she was dating, Dennis, found the names and personal information of all the singles and all but one of the couples who frequented the goods parties. It took only 2 days to send phishing emails to the computers of all the attendees, which, when the recipient clicked on a link, downloaded a virus that gave Gina all of the Mark's contacts, including email addresses. It was a goldmine. Kyle Good owned a local John Deere dealership, and he was a prime target. Gina and Dennis hacked into the store's work computer and downloaded the email and physical addresses of its customers. A website was created and hosted by a Ukrainian company. When I asked how we managed to do all this without being traced, Gina and Dennis just laughed and then tried to explain that the web host was paid in bitcoins. What the hell? And all the routing went through so many iterations that it would take the CIA to get to us. I nodded my head as they explained it all, but it still didn't make any sense, so I decided to trust their expertise. Harry Thompson was an enigma. We couldn't hack into his computer and couldn't find much personal information. He wasn't on Facebook, LinkedIn, or any other social media. Hood's computer didn't have his email address. We couldn't find where Harry worked. A complete mystery. Dennis suggested that Harry had probably gotten into some illegal shit, and we eventually gave up trying to find anything about Harry. One sunny Florida morning, Gina arrived at our parents' house where I was staying. She sat down at the kitchen table with her ubiquitous cup of black coffee and popped the question. All set, big brother. The website is up and running, the emails are loaded, a couple hundred emails to goods customers who don't have email accounts are stamped and ready to go. Are you ready to pull the plug from the socket? It was time to act. Yes, Gina, it's time. Let's get started and have a little fun. Gina pulled out her cell phone and gave the command. Dennis, send emails. Gina looked up at me. A friend of ours is going to Vegas today. He'll take the emails to the post office when he lands, and then no one will be able to trace them back here. I think we've covered our tracks as best we can. Thanks, Gina. Thanks for everything. I'll hit the road tomorrow and begin my travels. Gina held out a credit card to me. Dennis suggested something else. It was his idea for me to get a credit card in my name, in case I need to pay for something and can't use cash. He said that many state and national campgrounds require reservations, and you need a credit card for that. It's in my name, but it won't matter if you book the rooms in my name, and I won't complain to the bank's fraud department about being charged. That way, no one can trace you back to your card. It has a $5,000 credit line on it. You'll be able to pay me off whenever it suits you. I hugged Gina. It was almost too much to expect. Thank you. Thank Dennis, too. Well, don't forget that you promised we'd be spending time traveling together soon. Like I said, it's too hot and too crowded in Utah's national parks right now. Let's make an agreement to get together at the end of September and visit some of those parks. Having agreed to spend 2 weeks in September, Gina went to work. I, on the other hand, went to get the van ready for the trip. The next morning, I kissed my mom goodbye and gave my dad a manly hug, thanked them for letting me stay for a while, promised to be safe and stay in touch. And then my dad surprised me by leaning out the open window of the van's passenger door. I love you, son. I always knew he loved me. He'd shown it to me in 1,000 ways while I was growing up, but he'd never said it before. My eyes clouded over as I pulled off the road. I took the back roads north to Virginia's Blue Ridge Parkway and spent a week traveling southwest to North Carolina. Traveled north to Nashville, where I spent 2 days on Broadway listening to great music. I visited the National Monument in Shiloh. I've always wanted to see it since I did a report on the Western battles of the Civil War back in high school. I headed west, planning to stop in Memphis to spend time on Beale Street and perhaps visit Graceland. It was deep into the night. I was asleep in a van parked on State Highway 64 east of Bolivar, Tennessee, when I was awakened by a knock on the door. It was a state patrol officer standing with one hand on the butt of his service pistol. The holster was unholstered. "What can I do for you, officer?" "How long have you been parked here?" "I got here around 10 o'clock last night. Too tired to drive any further, so I decided to sleep for a few hours." "May I see your driver's license, please?" I handed him my license and he walked back to his patrol car to summon it. I sat in the passenger seat and waited for him to return. When he returned, I became concerned. There was something about the way he was looking at me. He still had his hand on his gun. "Mr. Baker, did you know there was a warrant out for your arrest?" "No, I didn't." "Does it say what I am alleged to have done?" "I don't know the details. It's a warrant for a misdemeanor. For what reason is someone looking for you in Minnesota?" I laid out the officer's version of what happened in Reader's Digest format, then added, "I guess some judge awarded my wife alimony, and I haven't paid it." The officer smiled. "Well, I have to bring you in, but right now I have to chase that car that just went by. I think it was a drunk driver and that takes priority over your warrant. You can stay here and wait for my return, or you can, 30 minutes from the state line, head south on Highway 18 and get out of my jurisdiction. You know what I'm talking about?" Since I missed Beale Street, the siren song of New Orleans and its Bourbon Street called to me, and I continued south. 3 days of drinking and listening to jazz, Zydeco, and Creole music had blown a hole in my wallet. I took off my gold wedding ring, bought a tank of gas, 2 bottles of Dixie, and a huge bowl of Tuffy's, then headed west out of town. I needed to avoid the big cities and the associated expenses before my funds dried up. I still had a few thousand left, but I was spending it too quickly. I talked to a few other vagabonds and learned from them how to limit the expenses associated with my new lifestyle. I learned how cheap it was to dry camp on BLM, Bureau of Land Management, lands. One of the couples I met along the way suggested I go to Big Bend National Park. They said it was like heaven. What the heck? I had nowhere to go and no one waiting for me to get there. I headed to Big Bend. Next chapter. I sat behind the bar at the Starlight Theatre Steakhouse in Terlingua, just outside the park boundary, and listened to the group of Australians at the next table shower each other with barbs. I was probably watching them too closely, trying to catch the meaning of the dialect, when the largest of them, a man of 66 and weighing at least 240, rose from the table and stood beside me. "It's not polite to eavesdrop on conversations, buddy." I must have been in a smartass mood because I could have gotten a punch in the nose for my response. "I wouldn't call it eavesdropping, since I can't understand half of what you all are saying, and even with that ridiculous accent." The mountain man backed away. "Well, you're a cheeky Yankee. What makes you think it's our accent that's funny and not your own?" "Well, you're sitting in a Texas bar, so it's your accent that's weird. If we were sitting in a Brisbane bar, it would be mine. And considering you're a guest in my country, let me buy you a beer." Any hostility was negated by my refusal to be intimidated, and more importantly, my offer to buy him a beer. The mountain man held out his hand. "My name is John. The beer is Foster's, and you are invited to join our table." My name is George, and I accept the invitation. I hadn't spent any social time since Florida, and while I only understood half of what was said, except when the speaker was kind enough to explain in English what he meant, I had the best time I'd had in months. These people knew how to drink and have a good time. Even the ladies drank under the table with me. There were 8 of them. They had traveled together and spent 4 weeks in the US, starting in Dallas. Eventually, they invited me to join their traveling caravan. It turned out that they had split into couples. One of the couples, James and Sarah, were married, and the rest had a friends with benefits relationship. Despite being out of my depth, I decided it was too good an opportunity to pass up and spent the next 2 weeks with them. Leaving Texas, our caravan traveled to Roswell, New Mexico. The Australians were eager to see where all the hysteria about UFOs had started. It was pretty much a failure, but at least now we could all say we'd been there and cross it off our respective lists. White Sands Monument was interesting. Although the men wanted to continue west to Tombstone, they were all big fans of the movie starring Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer. The ladies outweighed. This is going to be another tourist trap, and instead, we headed north to Colorado. I stayed out of the discussions and was happy to be anywhere with this happy bunch. The Rocky Mountains of Colorado amazed me. I wasn't prepared for such beauty. I grew up in the Midwest and spent all my time east of the Rocky Mountains. The Australians and I spent the last week together, zigzagging across the state and then splitting up in Breckenridge. They were heading back to Texas, and I was headed to Grand Junction, where Gina was scheduled to fly in to meet me. We spent our last night at a bar on Main Street, after which I said goodnight to them, promising that I would make it to Australia someday. As I was walking back to my van, Mary came up behind me and took my hand. "Can I stay with you tonight?" I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, but I didn't want to fight with my new friends, and I never wanted to be that guy who messes around with another man's woman. "What about John? Won't he be upset if you spend the night with me?" "John has his sights set on that blonde from America, and from the looks of it, he'll spend the night with her. John and I travel well together and have fun, but we're not what you'd call exclusive." Mary's offer was tempting. I've never had a one-night relationship before. I guess I'm an old-fashioned guy who likes to be committed to a relationship when I sleep with a girl. "Does that mean you don't want to sleep with me?" I looked at Mary, determined to end the lingering stalemate. "Hell no. Come with me." We drove back to the campground while Mary rubbed my ego, telling me that she had been hoping for this opportunity since the moment we met. "And the other girls will be green. We all think you're a cute and special guy." A few minutes after we parked the van in the parking lot, we got down to it. When I woke up the next morning, Mary was already up. When she saw me open my eyes, she leaned over and said, "Goodbye, George. Don't let what this woman has done to you affect your attitude toward the next one. There are many good, faithful women in the world. You're a wonderful man and you'll find one." I couldn't help myself. "Any chance she's you?" "No, I'm afraid it wouldn't work out. I would be too far away from my family and you would be too far away from yours. I've listened to you over the last 2 weeks. You're close to your sister and your parents. I couldn't take you away from them. And no grandmother wants to be half asleep from her grandchildren." Mary was right, of course. Thank goodness the first woman, since Jenny was smarter and more practical than me. Well, I had to ask. "Thanks for last night. You'll never know how much it meant to me." "I think I know. It meant a lot to me, too. Take care of yourself, George." Mary got out of the van. All the other Australians came to my station before heading out that morning. I was especially pleased to receive a firm handshake and hug from John. His smile was as wide as it could ever be when he reminded me of my promise to come visit someday. Heading into Grand Junction, I was feeling good. On the rearview mirror hung the necklace Mary had left there that morning. In the ashtray lay a note. "This is for Gina. Please tell your sister that I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to meet and that her brother is a gentleman and a great guy. Love, Mary." It was an inexpensive shell necklace that Mary always wore, and the note meant the world to me. Next chapter. Gina and I were walking through Arches National Park, heading toward Delicate Arch, when we crossed paths with another hiker. Abby Ross was walking alone. She was about 5'7" and had the build of an athlete. She has long black hair, naturally shiny, which favorably emphasized her swarthy skin and very dark eyes. She walked past Gina and I on the trail. We quickly exchanged hellos, and as we passed, Gina gave me a poke in the ribs and I asked, "What?" Gina only smiled at my attempt at playing dumb. You men are all the same. Just because a woman has the body of a goddess, you can't help but turn to jelly. Ah, and you're telling me that women are different in some way? I saw you practically drooling over that tall guy when we were standing at the carousel at the airport waiting for your luggage. Hell, I almost took a picture of you to send to Dennis. Let him see how you act when he's not around. God, don't you dare. I admit I looked, but I would never touch it. I've been absolutely faithful to Dennis since we've been together. So he's serious then? As serious as a heart attack. I suppose he's going to pop the question to me when I get back to Florida. He wanted to join us on this trip, but he couldn't make it. I was happy for my sister. She deserved a great guy like Dennis. When we got to the top, I was pleased to find a female hiker sitting there, taking pictures of the arch. Gina did me a big favor by walking up and introducing herself, and I stepped back 20 feet and opened my backpack to make lunch. The exchange between the two women was friendly. By the time I had everything ready, Gina came over and introduced us. Abby, this is my brother George. George, this is Abby Ross. I've been begging her to join us for lunch and finally talked her into it. We ate, told stories, and when it was time to go down, we hiked together. When Gina found out that Abby didn't have a campsite for the night, she offered to let Abby share a spot in the Devil's Garden with us. Abby protested, but couldn't change Gina's mind. The three of us shared an evening meal and a beautiful night under the stars, sitting by the fire. Thus began our friendship with Abby Ross from Klamath Falls, Oregon. Abby hiked with us in Arches and Canyonlands National Parks. She then agreed to accompany us when we traveled to Goblin State Park. Abby worked as a waitress in Klamath Falls and had recently graduated from the local community college. We eventually learned that she was hiking alone because her longtime boyfriend had left her for another girl 3 weeks before they were supposed to go on this trip. Abby decided to go alone, but was happy to join Gina and me. I didn't realize how lonely it would be without him. Thank you both for letting me come with you. After the Goblin, Abby had to head home, and we promised each other to stay in touch. I had another week to spend with Gina. We said goodbye to Abby and drove to Bryce. In the van, Gina began her interrogation. So, what do you think, big brother? Pretty nice lady, don't you think? A very nice lady. I agreed. But I didn't get any romantic vibes from her, so what's your point? My point is this. She's still hurting from the recent breakup, but I've caught her looking at you more than friendly on more than one occasion. Give her time, and she'll be ready for romance. For the next week, we didn't say anything more about our new friend. But as I was dropping Gina off at the airport, she brought it up. Give her a call, George. Maybe drive down to Klamath Falls and spend a couple days with her without me. I'll bet you $100 she'll say yes if you ask if you can come down there. Okay. Just so you stop hounding me, I'll call. Say hi to Mom and Dad for me and give Dennis my best wishes. Call me when you land. I went back to my van and pulled out a map. 1,000 miles if you took the scenic route. And best of all, most of the way was along US 50 through Nevada, the loneliest highway in America. How appropriate. I took my time and didn't mind being alone, especially after spending 2 weeks with the Aussies and the next 2 weeks with Gina. It gave me time to think. By the time I got to Reno, I had made my decision and called Abby. She seemed happy to hear from me and didn't hesitate when I asked if she wanted to keep me company. Abby had to work the next 2 days, and then she would have 3 days off, so I took my time and arrived the morning of her first day off. Abby and I spent those 3 days walking and exploring the southwest corner of Oregon, from Crater Lake to Ashland, where we saw Shakespeare's comedy, As You Like It, in a copy of the Globe Theater. It was a wonderful 3 days, and although it was crowded in the van, nothing romantic happened except holding hands. I would have loved to do more, but it was pretty obvious that Abby wasn't ready for that kind of relationship. Nevertheless, it was fun, and as I dropped her off on Thursday, I promised to stop by Klamath Falls when I got back from my next stop, Glacier National Park. I needed to get there soon. It was now late October, and winter would soon be upon us, especially at higher elevations. It was while in Glacier that I received a response to one of my inquiries regarding future employment. I contacted one of my former commanders, and she responded with an offer of translation services as a contractor. The best part was that the assignment was at the embassy in Paris. I had 3 weeks to catch a plane to Paris. I left Glacier that afternoon. I spent 2 days with Abby. She was able to switch shifts with two other waiters, and we spent those 2 days getting to know each other better. We ended up kissing and hugging, but not much more than that. It's always dangerous to step on the slippery slope of comparing one woman to another. Jenny could lounge in bed for hours. On weekends, she'd have a second cup of coffee and finish halfway through one of her magazines, Vanity Fair, Cosmopolitan, etc., without even thinking about getting up. By the time she got out of bed, I was already finishing breakfast and doing my morning chores. Abby couldn't wait to get up. By 10 o'clock, we were 8 miles from the trailhead or halfway to the mountaintop. Another important difference was that each of the women was reading. I had never seen Jenny with a book in her hands. Abby didn't just read books, she read literature. She was the first woman I dated who had already read the brothers Karamazov, Anna Karenina, and War and Peace. The more time I spent with Abby, the more I realized that she and I had similar views on almost everything I considered important. And perhaps just as important for a long-term relationship, I was completely captivated by her physical beauty. I hoped her ex-boyfriend wouldn't realize the error of his ways and try to rekindle their romance while I was overseas. I had fallen in love with Abby and told her so, but I would be gone for the next year, and I couldn't properly explain the nature of our relationship. Silly me. We did agree, though, that she would visit me in Paris. I drove straight to Naples, stopping at rest stops along the way to get my usual 6 hours of sleep. Sticking to the freeways, I reached my parents' house 4 days later, exhausted but happy. I had no trouble getting the necessary paperwork and visas, which meant something had changed in Minnesota. The charges against me had been dropped. I was no longer a fugitive. 10 days after arriving in Florida, I kissed my parents and sister goodbye and boarded a plane to Paris. Next chapter. In Paris, I met Simone Perrault. She was 25 years old and different from all the girls and women I had known up to that point. My parents would call her bohemian type. We hung out in cafes with her other bohemian friends, smoking galusas and drinking absinthe. We read and argued about Camus, Beauvoir, and Sartre. Simone's parents wanted a boy to name after their idol, Jean-Paul Sartre. When a girl was born, they decided to name her after Jean-Paul's longtime companion. The more I read about Sartre's apology for Stalin's abuses in the Soviet Union, the less I liked him, and the more I idolized Camus. Simone and I often argued about it. It was all great fun. I felt like Ernest Hemingway in the early 20th century. I never thought about falling in love with Simone. She was too different in her politics and values. We played together for 4 months until she left Paris with another couple, traveling to the Mediterranean town of Cap d'Agde. I missed the fun, but not the philosophical arguments that might have bored me. Perhaps it was a good time for our breakup, because for the past month I had been putting off Abby's visit. I was making good money, and I knew that paying for airfare was unaffordable for a waitress, so I sent Abby's plane tickets. She would be coming for 2 weeks in mid-May. Contrary to the song, May is much nicer than April. I have to say, I wasn't prepared for my reaction when I picked Abby up at the de Gaulle airport. I watched her walk towards me, and all my feelings of love for her flared up inside me. I took Abby to my apartment and told her to take a nap. She was on a red-eye flight from O'Hare. We were going to celebrate her arrival that evening. I left for work for a few hours, and when I got back to the apartment, I was pleasantly surprised. Abby had obviously spent some time shopping for city clothes. I'd never seen her in anything other than outdoorsy outfits, And here she was wearing the most appropriate skirt and sweater, with a stylish leather jacket and high-heeled shoes. She noticed the look on my face. Do you like it? It's fantastic. Let me tidy up and change into something appropriate to accompany such a lovely lady. It was a marvelous first night. Paris seemed to have taken Abby into its heart. For the next 5 days, I showed Abby all the usual Parisian sights. The Louvre and Musée d'Orsay, Notre Dame, the Shakespeare and Company bookstore, the top of the Eiffel Tower. At least 8 sites on Abby's must-see list. On the 6th day, we boarded the high-speed train and made the 3.5-hour drive to Grenoble. When I told Abby my plans, she protested that she hadn't brought decent hiking boots and clothes. Then she protested when I brought her to a store that sells necessities. She continued to protest until I convinced her that it was a late Christmas and early birthday present. Although there was still snow on the higher elevations, we hiked the alpine trails wherever we could. 3 days later, we headed to Paris and continued to fulfill Abby's list of things to do in Paris. Everything was going great until the last evening, when we stopped at a small cafe for a cup of tea before heading back to my apartment. And that's when it all went downhill. A group of Simone's friends, who knew that Simone and I were together, saw Abby and I enter the cafe and insisted that we join them. At one point, Abby and I were separated. She was talking to 2 women, and I was talking to men. When it was time to leave, I saw the look in Abby's eyes. When were you going to tell me about Simone? I wasn't going to. It was a brief affair with a woman before you and I became close. Now that you and I have become lovers, I'm willing to commit to being exclusive with you. I promise I will never be with another woman as long as we have that kind of commitment. Abby didn't calm down. I thought we were lovers when you left Klamath Falls last November. You said you loved me. I thought that meant something. I said I was falling in love with you, and it did mean something. We had to determine what it meant. Abby began to cry. What a fool I am. She went to the bedroom and began to get ready for her flight, another red eye. She walked out of the bedroom with tears in her eyes. I'll take a cab to the airport. Let me drive you. No, I need to be alone right now. I'm sorry this happened on our last night. I had such a good time with you, and now I feel like I'm just a substitute until Simone goes back to Paris. That's not true. Maybe it isn't, but it feels that way to me, and I need to think it over. Call me and we'll talk. It may be some time before we can talk. I'm traveling to Moscow tomorrow for important negotiations. While I'm there, communications will be limited because of the nature of those negotiations. Let me take you to the airport. No, just call me when you can. I love you, George Baker. She left without another word, but before the door closed, I told her. And I love you, Abby Ross. I was right. For the next 2 weeks in Moscow, communication was short and limited to family members. By the time I returned to Paris, my first phone conversation with Abby was strained. Before we could mend our relationship, I traveled to Moscow again because the agreements reached during the first round of negotiations were crumbling. Bad timing. Abby wasn't a bitch. On the contrary, she did her best to tell me that she understood me. But we needed to talk, and as soon as possible, before things fell apart. Next chapter. Gina, Dennis, Mom, and Dad came to visit in July. One of the great advantages of serving in Paris was that it didn't take much effort to convince people to come to visit for a while. Try doing the same at some of my previous Army duty stations. Gina brought great news. Jenny had called her to explain why I was no longer a fugitive. Jenny was renting out our old house to a couple, and they wanted to buy it. The sale of the house would be enough to pay off the mortgage and any remaining money owed to Jenny. If I signed the quitclaim deeds to the house, Jenny would think it was okay. Most importantly, Jenny filed for divorce, claiming she had been abandoned. We would be officially divorced by June of the following year without any further effort on my part. Gina had the papers. I signed them and mailed them to Jenny. We had a wonderful time in Paris. The only exception was when Gina sassed me for letting Abby go, in her words. Gina, I'm not trying to. I'll work it out when I get back to the States. I promise. Damn, you're such a fool, big brother. Do you really think a woman with such virtues, beauty, personality, and brains is going to sit around long enough to pine for your sorry ass? She was right. But for the next few months, there was little I could do but Skype with Abby and write love letters. My first stop on my return to the States was Klamath Falls. Abby not only welcomed me with open arms, she did everything she could to make me feel like we were a couple again. But there was one big problem. I needed a job, and the only West Coast offer I got was from a technology company in Los Angeles. Family was very important to Abby, and she wanted to stay close to her folks, while I needed to be somewhere where there were opportunities for my specialty, and Klamath Falls wasn't the place where those skills were needed. We were finally both on the same continent, but we lived 700 miles apart. For the next few months, we spent at least one weekend a month together, either in Klamath Falls or Los Angeles. In May, we took 2 weeks off from work. My boss swore but approved unpaid leave, in the interest of love, to hike Joshua Tree, Kings Canyon, and Death Valley. There was no doubt that we were right for each other, and in love, but I still had a hard time deciding to get married. This was most likely due to my own insecurities and other trust issues. Let's face it, my history of relationships with women didn't inspire confidence in me. Jenny hadn't dumped me, but I wasn't enough for her to remain faithful. And even though we weren't right for each other, it was Simone who dumped me, not the other way around. Abby claims to love me, but not enough to leave her family and join me in California. Abby and I continued to see each other at every opportunity. I was 100% faithful to her and had little doubt that she was too. I didn't give up. I kept looking for a way that we could be together. Next chapter. Sometimes life throws you curveballs, sometimes beanballs, and every once in a while you get a big, fat pitch that hits you right in your sweet spot. You can't help but hit it back. That July, I got 2 fat balls. First, I was contacted by a New York publishing house and offered the job of a lifetime. I was chosen to translate Joseph Stalin's personal papers and letters from Russian into English for a forthcoming book. Previously, these documents had been translated by a Russian, but the publisher realized that much had been sanitized. I had to do a second translation without bias. The job would take a little time, and best of all, I could do it from anywhere, even Klamath Falls. Then, less than a week after signing the contract with the publisher, the unbelievable happened. 2 years and 2 months after I left my home in Minnesota, I woke up to someone knocking on my door. I put on sweatpants and went to the door, opening it and wondering who could have been rude enough to wake me up at 7 in the morning. There stood Jenny. Hi, George. I hadn't expected such a greeting after all this time. I looked at Jenny's hands to see if she had a gun, but all she held was a manila envelope. May I come in, George? I stepped aside, letting Jenny into the room. Should I make some coffee? That would be fine. I left the hotel this morning before breakfast. I decided to be nice. Time softens a broken heart. I'll make scrambled eggs. I didn't come for breakfast, George. I came to deliver this. Jenny held out the envelope. Our divorce was finalized 2 months ago. I thought you should know. I listed abandonment of the child as the reason. I took a cursory look at the papers. You could have mailed them. I don't have anything to sign. Jenny began to lose her composure, her voice getting louder. I wanted to hand them to you in person. I didn't want to be a coward like you. I wanted to look you in the eye so you'd know how much I hated you for leaving me like that, without a word, just a note. And I wanted a wife who wouldn't spread her legs in front of a bunch of assholes. Jenny collapsed on the couch and burst into tears. But that didn't stop me from continuing. You have no idea how my heart broke when I saw you with Hood and the other clowns. Jenny had the sense to apologize between sobs. I'm sorry. Me too. I thought we loved each other and were ready to start a family. I was ready to have kids, and then that bitch Doris started coming over to our house for coffee. She filled my head with all kinds of nonsense. Said when you finally realized what you were missing, you'd join their group. That wasn't meant to happen. I really meant it the day we exchanged vows to leave everyone else behind. And I really meant it all those times I said you were the only woman for me. Jenny lowered her head, dropping her eyes to the floor. My curiosity took over and I asked her, "What happened after I left? Did you stay with the band?" "No, I never did again. After I got home and found your note, I didn't talk to Doris probably more than 2 or 3 times, and that was only when I couldn't get around to it. Besides, your little bombshell blew everything up." Jenny noticed the look in my eyes when she said, "Your little bomb." "Oh, George, don't pretend you weren't the one who posted the videos and pictures or sent anonymous letters to half of Minneapolis. Everyone suspected it was you, but no one had proof." "There was. I didn't think about it at the time, but I realized later that I had left a picture of you, Kyle, and Harry on the dining room table. If anyone saw the picture, they would have proof that it was me behind the website. I burned the picture 10 minutes after I saw it. I was sickened that there was documentation of my lewd behavior in our home. And even if I hadn't destroyed it, I would never have shared it with the others. I couldn't betray you a second time." "So what happened?" "First, Kyle Good lost his John Deere dealership. He had a community compliance clause in his contract with Deere. Who would have thought that progressive Minnesotans would be so outraged by Good's parties? When people stopped buying from the store, Deere walked out, leaving Kyle to peddle cheap Chinese tractors and other nonsense. The store went bankrupt. Kyle was up to his eyeballs in debt. Doris left him for Harry." "No shit?" I was pleased with this turn of events, but Jenny wasn't done yet. Kyle blew his brains out. "And Doris got to live happily ever after with Kyle's best friend?" Jenny shook her head. "No, it turns out Harry had anger issues, and after he put Doris in the hospital, he ended up in jail. He'll spend at least 8 years there." "8 years for hitting a woman? What did he do to her?" "Oh, it was for a reason. When the cops went to his house, they found he was distributing drugs. It just kept getting better and better." I couldn't keep from laughing. Jenny continued. "The other 2 couples moved out." "What about you, Jenny?" "Well, except for completely screwing up my personal life by pushing the man I love away from me. My professional life turned out well. No one gave a second thought to the personal life of a clothing salesman. I cut and dyed my hair, and most people didn't even realize it was me in those videos. But some did guess, and every now and then I had to deal with the consequences. I transitioned to full-time work and took community college classes in the evenings, got my AA degree, and now run a Banana Republic store in St. Louis Park. Good for you." And I meant it. Like I said, time had softened me. Jenny started to cry. "Will you ever see us back together again, George?" I may have softened, but my brain hadn't turned into Swiss cheese. "No, I'm sorry, Jenny, but it's not going to happen. All the trust is gone. Seeing you with those assholes shattered it. And you know as well as I do that a marriage without trust is never a happy one." "I knew you'd say that, George, but I just had to ask. As soon as I saw your face and heard your voice, I was reminded of what I had given up. So I had to try again. Forgive me, George." At those words, Jenny sobbed. Hell, I had once loved that woman with all my heart. That night, Jenny and I had dinner. During dinner, I just had to ask, "Why Jenny? I thought we had a good marriage. Why did you let Doris talk you into it?" "George, I was always such a good girl. Never did anything even slightly wild. You were the second man in my life. Doris played on my naivete. She convinced me that it was only a matter of time before you joined in on the fun. She said no red-blooded man could resist the opportunity to entertain a few women. It was never meant to happen, Jenny. The vow to leave everyone else behind meant everything to me." Jenny nodded as if agreeing with me before finishing her explanation. "Doris gave me a book. The more time spent reading and looking at it, the easier it was for Doris and Kyle to convince me to try it at the first party. It wasn't so hard for them to talk me into the second party where you got me. I drove Jenny back to her hotel. I could tell she was waiting for me to ask if I could stay the night, but I held firm. Yes, I could have entertained her and left, but that would have been wrong for many reasons, not the least of which was my commitment to Abby. Next chapter. Waking up the next morning, I looked at the clock. It was only 7, and Jenny's plane wouldn't leave until 11. I had just enough time to pick her up and drive her to the Los Angeles airport in time for her flight. Another chance to spend a few hours with the woman I'd wanted to love all my life. Instead, I sat down and drank a cup of coffee. Something was keeping me awake. Something that had woken me up at 3 in the morning and kept me awake for 2 hours. It all made sense now. The last night with Jenny had been like a cleansing of all the bile that had accumulated in my head and heart. My soul had been cleansed. I didn't realize until last night how important it was to close this chapter of my life with Jenny to start a new chapter with someone else, with Abby. I showered, packed up the car, and locked the apartment. With any luck, I'd make it 700 miles and be in Klamath Falls before Abby finished her shift tonight. I called, hoping it wasn't too early to call someone who works the late shift. She must have seen my name on her phone. Her voice sounded kind of sleepy. Hi, George. Good morning, Abby. Sorry to wake you up, but I was wondering if I could pick you up from work tonight. Why, where are you? I'm just leaving Thousand Oaks. I have to be there by 11. Is something wrong? No, I just need to be with you for a couple days. If you can spare me some time, we could take a little walk and talk. Sure. I'll switch shifts with Janet for tomorrow. Are you sure you should drive all day? I'll be fine. I'll see you at 11. I was 200 miles north when I realized I was going to propose empty-handed. I stopped at Ben's Bridge in Sacramento. I was looking at diamond rings when my gaze stopped at a display case of sapphires next to diamonds. One ring caught my eye and I walked over to it, much to the saleswoman's surprise. A sapphire? Yes, that one. An unconventional ring for an unconventional lady. It's perfect. Please put it in the box, no need to wrap it. The saleswoman smiled. She'll love it. How about the size? Let's hope she says yes. Then we'll think about the size. She put the ring in a beautiful blue box and swiped my credit card. Thank you. Good luck. But I can tell she'd be a fool to say no. I got back on the I-5 freeway and drove north. While driving, I called Gina, putting her on speakerphone so I wouldn't get a stupid ticket today. Sis, today is the day. I'm driving to Abby's with a ring in my pocket and the hope of the world in my heart. Gina was practically shouting over the phone. Good for you, George. Do you think she'll say yes? Gina laughed. Ask her nicely, and she'll be your fiancé by the time you get to the you part. I wish I had your confidence. Wish me luck, sis. Gina was almost right. I pulled up to the front door of the pub at 11 minutes past 5, and Abby came out to the car. I opened the door and got down on one knee with the box in my hands, but before I could say I will, she had already put her arms around me and said yes, kissing my lips, cheeks, nose, and forehead. It looked like I was going to get married again. We spent the next 2 days visiting her family, hiking in the mountains, and making love. Abby was especially excited to hear about my new contract. Seriously, George, am I going to marry you and live here? It was then that I realized that Abby had said yes to my marriage proposal without asking about how we would live. Now, with my new contract, it was a moot point. We would be able to live and raise our children, and she would have the support of a mother and father. Best of all worlds. 2 days later, I was on the road again. It was time to head back to Los Angeles and break the bad news to my boss. When I got back to my house, there was a note hanging on my door. George, I had some time this morning before my flight, and I thought I'd stop by to tell you again how sorry I am for betraying your trust in me. I don't know if we will ever have the opportunity to see or talk to each other again. But please understand, I know it was my immature, selfish behavior to listen to Kyle and Doris's bad advice. The only reason why we are not husband and wife today, and why I will never have our children. the children we planned and worked for. I will love and miss you always. BTW, I realize that you spared me the pain with the video. I know you had to capture me with those other men and in situations that I will be forever ashamed of. I think you did it to spare my parents and maybe spare me. Whatever the reason, I will always be grateful to you for showing me such mercy. You are a good man. Jenny. That was the last I heard of Jenny. Next chapter. It was October, a beautiful time in the Northwest. Abby and I were having a small wedding in Klamath Falls. Mom, Dad, Gina, and Dennis came to the wedding. 2 of my friends from the Army came too. That was the general contingent of the Bakers. On Abby's side, friends from high school, college, family, and co-workers walked down the aisle. We had an open bar, appetizers, a live band, and a dance floor. It was a lot of fun. Abby and I stayed until the last guest left. Our honeymoon was something completely different for us. Instead of spending a week camping in the woods or in the desert, we booked an entire week on a beach in the Virgin Islands. Sure, Abby got up every morning to run a few miles on the beach and then swim a couple more miles in the ocean. But every morning, after returning to our cabin and showering, she dragged me back to bed to repeat our wedding vows one more time. Epilogue. Translating the Stalinist documents earned me a reputation as the best translator of Russian literature into English. Because of this, I was able to earn a good income to support my growing family and work from home. Sometimes I had to travel to meet with authors or publishers, but that was no more than 3 or 4 weeks a year. Abby's mom died of cancer a year after our first son, George Adam or GA, was born. She went quickly, too quickly for Abby, but at least she lived to see her grandson and suffered briefly from cancer. It seems Mama Ross was the glue that held the family together, because over the next year, Abby's brother and sister-in-law moved to Tucson to be closer to her family. Abby's father said he was sick of the cold weather and moved to Baja, Mexico, near Ensenada. Suddenly, it became clear that there was no reason for our family to stay in Oregon. Abby was the one who brought it up. I think it would be great to live close to your folks and Gina. They could spend more time with GI. We sold our house in Klamath Falls and moved to Naples. 9 months later, Gina Abby was born. Mom and Dad couldn't be happy. I couldn't either. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.